The Vale 300 AC. Demon Targaryen. Bethune was remarkably untouched by war, and he and his companions both had differing views about it. Ser Mark and the Greatjon had seen and heard about the suffering their lands had gone through. While marching through the Riverlands, they'd come across Tywin Lannister's work more than once. The old lion having basically unleashed all the monsters that took their orders from him on any who stood in his way. Keeps had been destroyed, villages burned, small folk raped, tortured and murdered as the brave companions, Amory Lorch, and the Mountain were given free rein to do their worst. The Northmen and the Rivermen weren't free from guilt either. War brought out the worst in people after all. Yet they'd at least been somewhat restrained, or the worst of them had paid tenfold for when they were not. Tywin hadn't just encouraged his men to give in to their basest of natures, he demanded it of them, and when it did come time for him to pay for all his crimes, Daemon would give in to his in return. Moving around the town, he could see how annoyed the Greatjon and Ser Mark were getting at how people here moved, as if they hadn't a care in the world. So much so that when they finally made it to the tavern, he had to pull them both aside, and bid them hold their tongues. Something he was glad they agreed to do, as he had no wish to bring attention to himself while here. Not when he had much further to go, and more important things to do. There was only one room available to rent, and so he took it. The 2 beds would not see him sleep in either of them anyway, and it would only be for one night. On the morrow, the Greatjon and Ser Mark would head north to White Harbor, and so they sat, ate and drank, and spoke on meaningless things, or at least they did until they took to their room that night. "What plans have you got in the Vale, Demon?" the Greatjon asked when Ser Mark finally drifted off to sleep. "Many, Lord Umber, many. I was born a prince, some say a king, as my brother had been killed before I took my first breath. But in truth, it was a prince, as I'd not been crowned, and until it's placed upon your head, then all you are is an heir to that throne," he said, trying not to chuckle. The kindly man had used the same argument against him once when he'd named him a prince. Demon, taking the opposite view to the one he now took. "My birthright had been stolen from me, however, and so I was left with very little to inherit. Some letters my father sent to my mother, some songs he'd written for her, both their journals, and some papers which named me true. There had been some other things, some trinkets that had allowed him to walk into the Iron Bank and claim more of his birthright. But that was not for the man in front of him to know. And a list," he said when the Greatjon bid him continue. "A list?" the Greatjon asked, confused. "My God has many of them, Lord Umber, pray you never end up on one," he said, and he saw the small gulp the giant man took. "This one though was written in my mother's hand and bore few names, few but important ones. Before I breathe my last breath, each and every name on that list will be marked off, and the many-faced God will have his due, as will my mother." "There are names of people in the Vale?" the Greatjon asked. "There are but 2. he replied, not willing to share any more, which the Greatjon picked up on. "Walder Frey. He was on your mother's list. He was on mine own. I may not have known my cousin, or his mother, but they were my blood, Lord Umber, and my God gave me leave to see them pay for their crimes. They and others responsible for the Red Wedding. The Boltons," the Greatjon said, and the look on his face was one that Demon knew all too well, a look that said they were on a list of his own. "The Boltons will not rest easy on the seat they've stolen, no more than Tywin Lannister will," he said, and with that, he got the conversation done, and expected the Greatjon to go to his bed, only for the man to surprise him. "I knew your mother well, lad." "Not as well as I had hoped," the Greatjon said wistfully. "I was not alone in wishing her to be mine. I doubt there was a man in the north who didn't have that particular dream. She was a wild thing, and well, wild things seek to be free. I think that's why most of us truly march. Oh, don't get me wrong, I respected your grandfather and named your uncles my friends, but it was for your mother I marched, and I wager most of the others felt as I did." He watched as the man walked to his bed and sat down, the Greatjon looking at him all the while, and when Demon turned to look out the window, the man spoke his last words for the night. "I'm glad to find that it was not as I got. That she found that freedom she sought, and that the choices she made were her own. Should others speak as I did when you first told me, give them the time you gave me to speak more truly. For your mother was loved, Demon, and love is a powerful thing," the Greatjon said, and with that the room was silent for the rest of the night, or perhaps Demon was so lost in the thoughts that ran through his head that he simply didn't hear any more sounds. Ser Mark woke first the next morning, with the Greatjon waking almost an hour later. Demon had barely slept a few moments here, or there was all he allowed himself. Truth be told, there were few times when he slept a full night's sleep. The dreams that came to him when he did so were only part of the reason for that. His training being the main one. As unless you were with those of the order or those you trust, or in the house of black and white itself, you would more often than not be too alert to sleep. They broke their fast and made their way to the docks, both men walking just a bit quicker than they had up to then. The thoughts that one more journey would take them not just to safety, but to the beginnings of the vengeance and justice they sought were enough to make them both eager for it to begin. Both men were armed, and though not where they once were physically, he felt they'd be more than a match for anything they met on the way to White Harbor. Standing on the docks, he said his goodbyes to each of them, and when they asked if they'd see him again, he once again invoked his god's name. For it was only the god of death himself who'd stop that from happening. The North? Demon, who can I trust in the North? The Gretchen asked worriedly, the first time he truly saw the man so. Lord Wyman is a good man and true, and mine own men seek but one thing, to put a Stark back in the seat of winter. Speak to Lord Wyman and he'll tell you of others, but even if none come to my side, I fear not, and I'll have enough to see the Boltons fall. He said, and the Gretchen looked at him curiously. The company of the Rose, Lord Umber, they finally returned to the lands of their forefathers. He said, and the loud laugh the man made drew some attention, as did the smack to his back from the man's giant hand. You truly are a fucking wolf, aren't you? The Gretchen said. Not only, Lord Umber, not only. He watched the two men board the ship, and then the ship itself sail away. Once it was out of sight, he turned, and walked back into the town proper. The horse he purchased looked steady, and the supplies he bought should make his journey to the Erie as pleasant as it could be. Yet it was the words of the stable master that he felt would be his true comfort as he rode with the many others who were heading to the same place as he. A wedding was to be held which would make his arrival less suspicious. Now he and other men would seem to be there for the tourney that was being held to celebrate that wedding. The heir of the Vale was to be married, and while some felt he was marrying beneath him, others spoke of Peter Bailash's bastard daughter as being a beauty and worthy despite the stain of her birth. Demon found he cared not whether that was true or not, for the girl's father was who he sought, and not the girl herself. For far too long that man had stolen air that didn't belong to him, and that he had no right to breathe. He and the woman he now named as his wife. Reaching into his pocket, he took out the worn piece of paper, and looked at the names written there. Some he'd already crossed off, and others that had yet to meet their fate. 2 more were soon to be offered to the many-faced god, and the thoughts of that cheered him somewhat. Mother, he said softly as he placed the paper back in his pocket, and as they rode through the open lands to the mountains ahead. The storm lands 300 AC. John Pennington. He'd left Griffin's Roost garrisoned with some of his men, Ronnet telling him there was no need, and John explaining that when word came that he marched with the Golden Company, there would be some who may seek to sack the keep or take those that were inside hostage to get to him. His cousin was keener than to see him gone from the lands, and he didn't have to wait for long for that to happen. The raven had come from his king, and John read it with bated breath, and then marched not a day later. During his time in his family home, he'd learned more and more about the events in the realm, and what he heard had made him laugh, cry, and wish for vengeance even more so. The things that Tywin Lannister was capable of shocked even him. Though his Silver Prince had told him many years earlier what would happen should Tywin ever get too close to the throne he sought so avariciously. It had been after Duskendale and Aerys had been showing the first true signs that it was more than being a mercurial man that afflicted the king. He and Rhaegar had been sparring, and with Ser Arthur busy elsewhere, it had been he that was confided in. I fear it's broken him, John. My father is not the man he once was. You heard what he said to Tywin? Rhaegar asked, and John shook his head. He said that Tywin wished him dead, that ever since he denied him my hand he'd sought his head. Perhaps he has my prince. John said, and Rhaegar shook his head. If Tywin wished my father dead, then he'd have acted by now. Duskendale was my father's own folly, John. He should dismiss the man rather than provoke him so. For I tell you now that man may seem to accept my father's slights, but I fear he's simply adding them up, and one day he'll see to make us all pay for each and every one of them. Had your father but accepted the proposal, John said softly, hating the gods of his Silver Prince with anyone, most of all with Tywin Lannister's death. No, on that he was right, John. Even having his daughter as queen would not be the limit of Tywin Lannister's ambitions. Lions should be kept far from the throne, Jon, for not even dragons have eyes to look behind them all their lives, and lions are ever hungry, Rhaegar said as he put his sword away. As with most things, it turned out that Rhaegar had the right of it. Tywin and his pride of lions had feasted on the stag, the wolves, and soon they'd feast on the roses too. Or they would if his king didn't wish to feast on them first. The march to Storm's End took days, and was a tiring one. Jon listening to his men gripe about not liking these lands, and he found it both annoying and amusing since each of them had so often wished to name lands like these their home. Though perhaps it was warmer lands they sought, the Reach and all its bounty, the Riverlands, or even Dorne. Was he to wager it would be the West that most ended up in the Rock, Lannisport, and keeps whose lords propped up the old lion to be the ones who lost the most when this war was done? He sent his outriders out to forage and scout, and found that while some battles had been fought, more and more keeps had simply surrendered once it was clear they weren't there to sack them or rape and kill those inside. Whether it was because they had fought and lost and were already broken, or that Stannis Baratheon had abandoned these lands and taken most of its true warriors with him when he left, he cared not. The Storm lands were theirs other than its largest keep, and when he finally saw Storm's End come into view he smiled. It turned out he was the last of those sent out to arrive, homeless Harry, having come straight here and besieged the keep without besieging it. Instead, he'd just gone through the mummery of a besieging, set the tents and pickets up, as if he was doing so while offering to parley from the moment he'd arrived. Jon knew word would spread to Tywin and King's Landing. He knew that Varys would not be able to keep their arrival quiet, and he wondered just what was going through the eunuch's mind when he'd heard. This was not the plan that he or the Fat Magister wished them to follow, and he was surprised that the eunuch had not gotten in touch by now. It was not a surprise he held on to for long, as it was simply he that Varys hadn't managed to contact. Griff, thank the fucking gods. Maybe you can talk some sense into that cowardly fuck, old Jon Mudd said before he even managed to get down from his horse. What's he done now? He asked exasperatedly. He wishes to negotiate with the Lannisters, Jon. Grendel Byrne said as he and some of the other men of the company made their way to him. Of all them. He stormed into the tent, passing by the pikes that bore the golden skulls of the previous and better captain generals. Inside he found Black Balak Borys Edarin, Bliss Nomar, and homeless Harry himself. You wish to die, Harry? To find yourself face to face with a man with none? He asked angrily. I only suggested. Fuck you and your suggestions. We signed a contract, or don't you fucking remember? Our word is as good as gold. He spat angrily. We already broke one contract, Griff, Harry said, and Jon moved so quickly to him that the man didn't have a chance to react. That none stopped him showed he was in the right of it too. We aren't breaking this one. All that talk, all those fucking words spouted for all those years, Harry. They mean something. We follow the dragon and that's final, am I clear? I'm a fucking craven who only serves because we will it so. Remember that, and I swear it here and now. One more word about breaking this contract and I'll end you my fucking self. He said before he stormed from the tent. He needed a drink, a rest, a wash, and maybe even something to eat. It was to be the first of them that he got, and he was not alone when he sat down to drink the ale. Bliss Snow, Balak Dick, and Will Cole, both old and young Jon Mudds, and some of the other sergeants of the company soon joining him. It's good you came when you did, Griff, Bliss Snow said, handing him the note from the eunuch. He nodded as he took it, opening it up to read it, and he laughed when he did so. Harry, the time to fight is not at hand, the Lannisters are still too strong. However, there is room for a deal to be done. Make overtures and seek a parley. Once the lions let down their guard and think you true, then, and only then, would the time be right. I shall see you soon, my friend. Give our king mine. S. A friend. Holding the note to the candle, he watched it burn, and took another swallow of the ale. Looking to the wine bottle that Balak held in his hand, he nodded and was soon handed a glass filled with some of the best the arbor had to offer. It was a pleasant taste, but he was no longer a man who got drunk, or at least he'd promised himself he'd not do so until demons sat his throne. Can you get a letter to the old lion? He asked, and Bliss Snow looked at him in surprise, only for his smile to show it was not what he got. I can. Good, I'll write it out. I need to rest. Tomorrow we take this keep and the day after we march. He said, and around him, all those present nodded. It took him some time to write the words out how he wished, the letter an invitation of sorts, but not to parley. He was pulling on the lion's tail, or he would be, and as he slept that night he dreamt of silver hair and heard the sounds of a harp playing and the voice of a man he loved singing a song. This is the song of ice and fire, and one day you'll hear it for true. The silver shadow in his dream said, and Jon felt that day was coming ever closer. King's Landing 300 AC. Varys. It was a strange feeling for him to be so out of the know. For him to be taken so completely by surprise not once but twice, was something that had never happened before. True, he wasn't all-knowing, and over the years certain things had happened that he'd not known the truth about until they did, though they were few and far between. The disappearance of Lady Lyanna Stark, and where Roger had taken her during the war. Ned Stark's execution, and the escapes of both the Stark girls. These though were minor inconveniences and affected his own plans, not a jot, and so he'd not been irked too much by being in the dark. A faceless man arriving in King's Landing to take down the mountain and free Tyrion Lannister. An attack on the twins and rescue of the prisoners held there, and the death of its lord. Would that they were the only things that had happened that he had been unaware were in the works. The Golden Company arriving on Westeros' shores without him sending for them. That, however, had shocked him completely, because that was not only unexpected, it was something he had control over. Why had they come now without being called? What didn't he know? Why didn't Illyrio contact him? What was he to do? Over the years he'd asked himself so many questions, and had always found the answers easy to come by. For once he found them as elusive as he himself had always tried to be. He was in the dark, and the dark, for a man who knew everyone's secrets, was not a place he dared to stay in for long. The first thing he did was to reach out to Illyrio, though it would take time for his good brother to reply. Once he'd done that, he'd set his little birds to task and sent them to scour the Stormlands. He needed to speak to homeless Harry, and he needed to do so sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, he was not the only one aware of the Golden Company's landing. Varys hearing from his little birds and chatayas of a Stormlands night speaking of such, and so he was left with no choice but to bring it to Tywin Lannister and the small council's attention. Much though he had hoped to keep such news from them for as long as he possibly could. The simple truth was that were he not to tell them about it, and instead, they heard it elsewhere, then his own position and perhaps even his head would be in danger. Tywin Lannister was not a man who brooked failure or incompetence, and he already considered him not knowing the truth about Demon Roger as one or the other. The reaction to the news was one he expected, one he feared somewhat, and so the letter he had delivered to homeless Harry preached caution. While Tywin and the Tyrells would fight against an invading army, both were always more likely to buy off their enemies rather than kill them off if they got a chance. Should the Golden Company accept an offer from the Lord of Casterly Rock, then Tywin would think them under his thumb, which in turn would make it easier to stab him in the back. Yet he'd received no reply, and he knew it was not here that he needed to be. It was the Stormlands where his presence was truly required for his own peace of mind. He needed to speak to Jon Pennington, more than that he needed to see her son. Lord Varys, another meeting. Wonder what this one is regarding. Mace Tyrell said, and Varys resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Perhaps events in the Stormlands, my lord, or at the Twins, he said, and he swore the look Mace gave him was one that truly showed the man to be the lackwit that everyone believed him to be. Oh yes, of course. Mace blustered, and Varys would have thanked the gods had he believed in them when he saw Tyrion was already present in the small council chambers. Lord Tyrell, Lord Varys, Tyrion said as they took their seats. Lord Tyrion, Mace said haughtily as the then looked around the small council chambers for what Varys knew not. The other Lannisters arrived before he could speak to Tyrion. Tywin, Keevan, Jaime and Cersei, who were both following after their father and uncle. Pycelle for once moved quickly as he took his seat, and Varys was surprised when Oberyn Martell then entered the room. The prince had not been invited to their first discussion about the Golden Company's arrival, and as far as Varys knew, he knew not about that, or about the events in the Twins. Something that he was proved right and wrong about, not more than a few moments later. Why was I not informed of this? Oberyn asked angrily. Lord Varys was busy investigating the veracity of these reports, Prince Oberyn. There was a wish not to speak to you on them until we had confirmed they were true and not some ruse. Tyrion answered for his father, and Varys saw the small curl of Tywin's lips as he welcomed his son's words. A large force of men arrives in the Stormlands, and you need to investigate the truth of it. What makes you think it is a lie? Who do you think gains from such subterfuge? Oberyn asked with a smirk on his face as he spoke. Not all our enemies are dealt with, Prince Oberyn, Tywin said pointedly, as events at the Twins would point out. Oberyn said, almost chuckling now, and Varys saw how Tyrion looked to his father, who was staring directly at Oberyn Martell. Could it be Dorne? Had they hired a faceless man? No, he dismissed those thoughts almost as soon as they came to him. Were Dorne to hire a faceless man to gain their revenge, it would make this room one that had far fewer people in it. While they may seek to make the mountain pay, Varys was sure that Oberyn himself had wished to be the one to do so. As for the twins, the only ones who had a true reason to see Walder Frey fall were the Starks, and the Starks were all dead. No, this was another player in the great game, and it irked him that he knew not who it was. Dorne will ready its armies. The Golden Company rampaging through the Stormlands places them too close to our own borders, and so by your leave, Lord Hand, and by his graces as well, I shall return to Sunspear and lead the army myself. Oberyn said, and Varys cursed himself for getting lost in his thoughts. And will Dorne march, or stay and protect its borders, Prince Oberyn? Tywin asked pointedly. Dorne and I may have issues with you, Lord Hand, but we are of Westeros too. We shall march, and should your men join us in doing so, then we shall be the anvil to your hammer. Oberyn said, and Varys swore he saw the beginnings of a smile on Tywin's face. Then our own army and the Reaches will meet in the Kingswood and march to face the Golden Company head-on. Lord Tyrell, see that your banners are called, and that they answer most enthusiastically, and with great haste. Tywin said, glaring at Mace Tyrell, who wilted under his gaze. As you command, Lord Hand. Pycelle ravens are to be sent calling on all Lael houses to begin preparing to send men and supplies. At once, Lord Hand. Even our own men. Tywin said to a nod from his brother Lord Varys, before we leave I want a full accounting of the strengths the Golden Company can bring to bear. A full list of all we know of them down to their leaders, and the men who command each section of their forces, am I understood?